I never imagined that the happiest day of my life would also be the one that broke me open in front of everyone I loved and everyone who was waiting to see me fall. My name is Emily Parker. I am 29 years old, and on the morning of my wedding, I believed for one fragile moment that maybe, just maybe, my mother would finally let me have my day. The church bells outside rang with such hopeful music as I stood in a small dressing room wrapped in white satin and lace, staring into the mirror and trying to steady my breath. My heart was racing from joy, from nerves, from the weight of years of carrying expectations that never seemed to fit. The door creaked open, and in walked my mother, Margaret Parker, perfectly coiffed as always, pearls around her neck, that familiar tight smile that had haunted me since childhood. She came close, so close that I could see the faint lines of disapproval etched around her eyes. She leaned in and whispered words that sliced sharper than any blade. "You will embarrass us all." For a moment, I could not breathe. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I thought she was done, but then she reached into her clutch, and before I could even understand what was happening, she pulled out a pair of small sewing scissors. With one swift motion, she pressed them against the delicate fabric at my hip and sliced downward. The sound of satin tearing filled the room, louder than the church bells, louder than my pounding heart. My wedding dress, the dress I had dreamed about since I was a little girl, split open under her hand. I gasped and staggered back, clutching the ruined fabric as tears blurred my vision. She stepped away calmly, slipping the scissors back into her bag, smoothing her skirt as if she had only adjusted her lipstick. Her voice was low, cold, final. "Now the world will see what I have always known. You were never ready." I stood frozen shock, locking my limbs, shame burning my cheeks. My best friend Sarah burst into the room at that moment, saw the torn gown, and her face went pale. "Emily, what happened?" she whispered, but my mother was already walking out the door, her heels clicking against the floor like punctuation marks to my humiliation. Guests were gathering in the sanctuary, music was beginning, and I was left in shreds, literally and emotionally. In that instant, something inside me shattered. Years of insults, years of comparisons to my perfect sister Olivia, years of being told I was too weak, too messy, too ordinary, all came crashing down into a single truth. My mother had chosen my wedding day, the one day meant to celebrate love and new beginnings, to finally destroy me. But as I clutched the torn fabric, as Sarah grabbed a shawl to cover me, so I could still walk down that aisle, another truth rose up stronger than the shame. If she thought she had ended me, she was wrong. That cruel act would not be the end of my story. It would be the beginning, and I promised myself then and there that she would never again hold the power to define who I was or how I lived. She thought she had ruined me. Instead, she had set something unstoppable in motion. From the outside, the Parker family of Charleston, Virginia, looked like the perfect example of Southern grace and stability. Our white brick house stood at the end of Willow Lane, with manicured hedges cut in precise shapes and roses blooming in a neat row each spring. Neighbors often complimented my mother Margaret on how beautiful the property looked, unaware of the sharp orders she barked at me whenever a single leaf lay out of place. Margaret Parker was admired in church circles. She organized luncheons, served on the women's committee, and made sure her hair and pearls never shifted out of line. People whispered that she was the kind of mother every girl would be lucky to have. Inside those walls, however, I knew a very different truth. My father, Richard Parker, a respected lawyer in town, was always stern and silent. He spent most evenings behind a newspaper or locked in his study, emerging only when Margaret called him for dinner. He rarely contradicted her, instead nodding along to whatever she declared, even if it meant watching me shrink under her criticism. My older sister Olivia was 3 years ahead of me in age and miles ahead in my mother's eyes. Olivia was brilliant, beautiful, destined for success. She became the golden child praised at every gathering, paraded as an example of perfection. I was the comparison point, the shadow, the disappointing daughter who never quite measured up. The outside world saw a happy family that attended Sunday service together and smiled in photographs. They saw Margaret's hand resting proudly on Olivia's shoulder, while Richard adjusted his tie and I stood quietly at the edge of the frame. What they did not see was Margaret's whisper in my ear before the camera clicked, telling me to stand straighter, lose weight, or stop fidgeting because I looked ridiculous. They did not see Richard glance at me with weary eyes and then look away rather than intervene. They did not see Olivia smirk when Mother's words landed sharp and cruel. The Parker family presented perfection but demanded sacrifice, and I was always the one asked to give more. Behind closed doors, Margaret scrutinized every choice I made. She rearranged my clothes, corrected my speech, dictated which friends were acceptable and which were not. She made it clear that my worth was measured only against Olivia's accomplishments, and that scale was permanently tipped against me. To the church, she was a model of generosity to the neighbors. She was grace itself, but to me, she was the voice that told me I would never be enough. Growing up in that house felt like living on a stage where the audience applauded the act while I carried the bruises of rehearsal. Richard would sometimes attempt a weak defense, telling me not to take things too personally, insisting that my mother only wanted the best. Yet he never stopped her, never raised his voice against hers, never once told me that I was fine just as I was. Olivia, for her part, learned early how to play the role, echoing Mother's opinions, shining brightly while I grew dimmer. The contrast between how the world viewed us and what actually happened inside those walls was the defining pattern of my life. That contrast would one day explode in front of a wedding crowd when Margaret showed her true face not only to me, but to everyone who had ever believed the performance. At the time, though, I only knew that home was a place where my voice was small. My dreams were unwelcome, and my mother's shadow stretched long over everything I touched. My earliest memories are not of warmth or laughter, but of constant correction and the sting of words that told me I was never quite right. I was 5 years old when I first realized that Olivia would always be the shining star, and I would always be the dim candle. At the church Christmas pageant, Olivia wore her angel costume and received praise from every adult while I fumbled with my shepherd's robe and listened to my mother hiss that I looked sloppy and embarrassed the family. That night, when I tried to show her the paper star I had cut out, she snatched it from my hand, crumpled it, and told me to stop wasting time. Olivia's star still hangs in a frame somewhere in the living room. Those patterns repeated year after year. I remember being 6 and drawing a picture of our house with bright colors and a crooked chimney. My teacher gave me a ribbon for creativity. I ran home eager to show my mother, hoping for one smile. Instead, she tore it in half and said that I should be doing math worksheets like Olivia, not scribbling childish nonsense. My father walked in at that moment, hesitated, and told me quietly later that he was proud, but he never dared to say it in front of her. It was like living in 2 worlds, one where I tried to bloom and another where each bud was clipped before it could open. By the time I was 8, I knew to hide my report cards if they had anything less than perfect marks. If Olivia earned an A, she was taken for ice cream. If I earned a B+, I was grounded and told I was lazy. At 10, I stood in front of the mirror, tugging at my dress while my mother said the words that branded themselves into my skin. "You are getting pudgy. No boy will want you if you keep eating like that." I was just a child, but I began skipping desserts and counting every bite, desperate to please her. My father tried to soften the blows, bringing me small gifts like colored pencils or sneaking my drawings into his office to pin on the wall, but his comfort was fleeting, a whisper against the roar of my mother's constant criticism. When I was 12, I auditioned for the school play. I got a small role as a villager, and to me, it felt like a triumph. On opening night, I scanned the audience, hoping to see Margaret's approving gaze. Instead, I found her seat empty. She claimed she was too busy with church duties. Richard came alone and clapped loudly, his eyes full of pride, but the absence of her applause rang louder than the cheers of everyone else. Olivia, meanwhile, was excelling in every field soccer trophy, spelling bees, science fairs. My mother bragged about her endlessly to neighbors sometimes while I was standing right there. "Why cannot you be more like Olivia?" she would say, as if the answer was obvious. I learned to shrink, to lower my voice, to become invisible, rather than risk further humiliation. The only time I saw my mother cry was when my grandmother passed away. For a brief moment, I thought grief had softened her, that maybe she would draw closer to me. Instead, she turned colder, harsher, pouring all her disappointment into shaping me into something I could never be. At 14, I started keeping a journal writing down every cruel phrase, every moment when I felt small. It became my only refuge, the place where I told the truth since no one else seemed to see it. When I showed it once to my father, he hugged me quickly but told me to lock it away and not upset my mother. I realized then that even he feared her disapproval more than he cared about my pain. High school only widened the gap. Olivia left for college in New York City, her achievements still echoing through our house like a constant reminder of what I was not. Margaret began leaning on me for chores, cooking, and errands, telling me I owed her obedience because she had given me life. She scrutinized every outfit I wore, every friend I made, and every boy who showed interest. When Daniel asked me to homecoming and I nervously accepted, she intercepted the corsage he brought and told him I was not allowed to date someone beneath our family. I cried that night in my room while Olivia sent photos of her glamorous dorm life. The seeds of resentment, humiliation, and silent rage were planted deep in those years. My childhood was not filled with safety, but with constant reminders that I was unwanted, that love had to be earned, and I was always failing. Those roots of pain would one day grow into the strength I needed to stand up to Margaret, but at the time, they only felt like chains binding me to a life of silence. When I turned 18, I thought freedom was finally within reach. I had earned a partial scholarship to a design school in North Carolina, a dream that had kept me alive through the darker years of high school. For the first time, I imagined leaving Charleston, leaving the constant comparisons, leaving the house where every wall carried echoes of my mother's sharp voice. Yet Margaret found a way to pull me back. She began complaining of dizzy spells just as I was preparing to accept the scholarship. The doctors could not find anything wrong, but she insisted she needed me at home. She cried in front of Richard, telling him that if I left, she might collapse alone in the kitchen. He urged me to consider a local option, reminding me that family came first. So I gave up the scholarship, gave up my dream, and enrolled at a nearby state university 30 minutes from home. My mother never thanked me. She told the neighbors proudly that Olivia was thriving in New York while I had wisely chosen to stay close to help. That was the first major sacrifice, but far from the last. I majored in education rather than design because Margaret insisted that teaching was respectable and would not lead me to ruin. I wanted art. I wanted to create, but I obeyed. I commuted from home most days, shuttling between classes and the errands my mother demanded. "Bring me my prescription fix, the curtains drive me to church, clean the gutters," she said, as if my schedule did not matter. Richard occasionally told me to focus on school, but never stopped her from piling more on me. Olivia called on holidays, her voice echoing through speakerphone as Margaret gushed about her achievements. "Emily is fine," she would add quickly when someone asked about me as though my existence was a footnote. After graduation, I took a teaching job in the local elementary school. It was stable, close by exactly what my mother wanted. When I told her I was proud, she simply said that it was nothing compared to Olivia saving lives in the hospital. I bought a small apartment 2 blocks from her house with the hope of carving out a little independence, but she used that closeness to her advantage. She called me every morning with new demands. "The sink is leaking, come fix it. The grocery bags are heavy, come carry them. My hip hurts, so you need to drive me." She often mentioned her fixed income as if she were helpless, conveniently ignoring the investment portfolio my father had built for her. By 25, I was exhausted single and unsure of who I was outside of her control. I dated briefly, but every relationship ended once Margaret intervened. Daniel from college was chased away when she told him I was unstable. Another man left after she publicly mocked him at dinner, saying he would never amount to anything. The message was clear. If I loved someone, she would destroy it. If I pursued anything beyond her orbit, she would sabotage it. I began shrinking into a routine of work and service, convincing myself that this was what daughters were supposed to do. The few times I pushed back ended in shouting matches. She would accuse me of being ungrateful, of trying to humiliate her, of forgetting who had raised me. Richard stayed silent, his face hidden behind the newspaper. Olivia rarely visited, and when she did, Margaret transformed into a sweet, doting mother who baked pies and told stories of her perfect children. I became invisible in my own home. By the time I turned 28, I was promoted to lead teacher at my school, an achievement that made me glow with pride for a fleeting moment. I told my mother over dinner, expecting maybe a small smile. Instead, she said that it was hardly the same as being a doctor like Olivia. That night, I sat in my car outside her house and realized I had been trading pieces of myself for scraps of approval that would never come. Every decision I had made as an adult had been bent around her needs. College, career, relationships, even where I lived. I had allowed her to define my world, and in doing so, I had lost myself. That realization simmered inside me, preparing the ground for change, though at the time I still lacked the courage to act. I convinced myself that sacrifice was love and control was guidance. Only later would I understand that what I had endured was not love at all, but a carefully crafted prison built out of manipulation and fear. I met Michael Adams on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I least expected it. I was standing in the school library shelving books after class when he appeared at the doorway dripping wet from a sudden downpour. He was there to set up the new computer system as part of his engineering company's contract with the district. He flashed a sheepish smile and asked if I had a towel. Something about the honesty in his voice made me laugh, a sound I had not heard from myself in far too long. Over the next few weeks, I found reasons to linger whenever he returned for technical support. Michael was 33, kind patient, with a quiet strength that contrasted sharply with the constant criticism I lived with at home. He asked questions about my drawings when he saw me sketching lesson plans, and unlike my mother, he listened as though my ideas mattered. Slowly, against the background of Margaret's control, I felt a fragile hope begin to grow. When he asked me out for coffee, I almost said no, afraid of what my mother would say, but something inside whispered that I deserved this. That first coffee turned into dinners, walks through the park, and evenings filled with laughter. Michael never mocked me, never made me feel small. For the first time in years, I felt like a whole person. Yet, I knew Margaret would not approve. When I finally introduced him, she greeted him with a frozen smile. Within minutes, she began interrogating him about his salary, his family background, his church attendance. When he admitted his parents were retired teachers and that he rented an apartment instead of owning a house, she dismissed him with a single glance. "He is not good enough for you," she said later, but her eyes told me she meant he was not good enough for her. I tried to defend him, but her words lingered like poison. Olivia joined in during one holiday dinner, making sly comments about how I should be careful not to settle for less. Michael noticed the tension, but instead of backing away, he held my hand tighter. "I love you, Emily," he said one night after walking me home. "I want a future with you." Tears filled my eyes because I believed him, yet fear gnawed at me. When Michael proposed with a simple gold ring on my 29th birthday, my heart soared. I said yes without hesitation, but dread crept in when I thought of telling my mother. Margaret's reaction was colder than winter. She accused me of rushing, of making a mistake, of embarrassing the family by marrying beneath our status. She told Richard that he should talk sense into me, but he only muttered that I was an adult. Olivia rolled her eyes and whispered that I was desperate. It was the same pattern I had endured all my life, but now something was different. I had Michael by my side, and he refused to be silenced. He stood up to Margaret, telling her politely but firmly that our marriage was our choice. She glared at him with icy fury. I knew then she would not simply oppose, she would retaliate. The months leading up to the wedding became a battlefield. Margaret criticized every plan. The venue was too modest, the flowers too plain, the guest list too short. She offered to take over the planning, but I refused. Each refusal sharpened her resentment. She began spreading whispers in the church that Michael's family was unreliable, that I was rushing into a disaster. Some friends withdrew, unsure whom to believe. Sarah remained loyal, reminding me that love was worth fighting for. Despite the tension, Michael and I pressed on. We chose the church where I had once performed in that school play she never attended. It felt symbolic, a place where I could reclaim my story. On the surface, the preparations looked joyous, but underneath, I felt the storm gathering. My mother had never allowed me to make a decision without consequence, and this was the biggest of my life. Deep down, I feared she would try to ruin it, but I also knew that if I gave in again, I would lose everything. The closer the wedding came, the more determined I became. I told Michael through tears one night that I was terrified. He pulled me into his arms and said, "Then we will face her together." That promise gave me strength. I did not know how far Margaret would go, but I sensed she would strike hard. I was right. The morning of my wedding began with a deceptive calm. The sun filtered through the curtains of the bridal suite, bathing the room in soft golden light. My bridesmaids bustled around me with cheerful chatter, adjusting flowers, touching up makeup, and making sure every detail was perfect. Michael had sent over a handwritten note that read, simply, "I cannot wait to see you walk toward me." It steadied my heart, even as anxiety simmered beneath my excitement. I told myself that nothing, not even Margaret's disapproval, could ruin this day. Yet I knew my mother too well to believe she would sit quietly. Margaret arrived at the church an hour before the ceremony, dressed in a pale lavender gown that screamed authority. Her pearls gleamed, her hair was immaculate, and her eyes carried the sharpness of someone preparing for battle. She did not hug me. Instead, she circled me like a critic inspecting a flawed painting. "The dress is too simple," she said under her breath. "Everyone will notice." I ignored her and focused on the joy that radiated from Sarah, my maid of honor, who whispered encouragement. Guests filled the pews, murmurs of admiration floating through the air as the organist practiced soft notes. I took a deep breath, believing that once I walked down that aisle, all of Margaret's barbs would fade behind me. That was the dream. Reality was far harsher. Just before the ceremony began, Margaret leaned in close as the bridesmaids adjusted my veil. Her voice was low enough for only me to hear. "You will embarrass us all," she hissed. My stomach twisted, but I kept my eyes forward. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me falter. She stepped back, her expression the picture of maternal pride for anyone watching. Then, as I turned toward the mirror one last time, she moved quickly, pulling something from her clutch. With the swiftness of a predator, she pressed sharp scissors against the delicate lace of my gown and sliced downward. The sound of fabric tearing ripped through the room louder than any organ chord. Gasps erupted from the bridesmaids. I froze in shock as the satin fell open at the side, exposing the petticoat beneath. My breath caught my vision, blurred with tears. Margaret stood with the scissors in hand, her face composed as though she had simply trimmed a loose thread. "Maybe now you will learn," she whispered. The room spun. I felt humiliation crash over me in waves. My dream dress, the symbol of the life I was choosing, was in tatters minutes before I was to walk down the aisle. For a moment, I could not move, could not speak. Then, Sarah rushed to my side, her hands shaking as she tried to hold the fabric together. "Emily, it's okay. We can fix this," she insisted. Other bridesmaids scrambled for pins and tape. My heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone outside the room must hear it. Margaret calmly placed the scissors back in her purse and smoothed her gown as though nothing had happened. If anyone asked, she would smile and say she was simply helping. Rage surged inside me, hot and sharp, cutting through the humiliation. This was her plan all along, to destroy me in front of everyone. She had not been satisfied with whispers or disapproval. She wanted to mark this day with ruin. Yet as I looked into the mirror, I saw not only the torn fabric, but also my own eyes, fierce and determined. I would not let her win. Sarah and the others worked frantically, pinning and stitching with whatever they could find. Within minutes, they managed to secure the tear enough for the dress to hold. It was not perfect, but it was wearable. I wiped my tears, straightened my shoulders, and whispered thank you to Sarah. When the doors opened and the music swelled, I walked down the aisle with my head high. Michael's eyes met mine, filled with love and concern. He saw the imperfection, but he also saw my resolve. The guests murmured in confusion, some noticing the uneven hem, others whispering behind hands. Margaret sat in the front pew with a smile fixed on her face, the picture of grace. Inside, I knew she believed she had won. But instead of crumbling, I let each step be a declaration that I was stronger than her cruelty. The ceremony moved forward, though my heart raced with every vow. When Michael took my hand and promised to cherish me always, I felt the chains of my mother's control begin to crack. At the moment we were pronounced husband and wife, applause thundered through the church. Margaret clapped lightly, her expression unchanged, but I saw the flicker of frustration when she realized her sabotage had not broken me. Outside, the church guests congratulated us with warm embraces. Yet whispers still floated through the crowd about the damaged dress and the strange tension they had sensed. Margaret lingered near telling anyone who asked that a seam had simply come loose. Her lies wrapped around her like armor, but I could see the truth in her eyes. She wanted me humiliated. She wanted Michael to doubt me. She wanted control. As the reception began, I caught her watching me with thinly veiled satisfaction. I knew this was not over. Her act of destruction had been public, and though most guests remained polite, the seeds of doubt had been planted. For the first time, I felt the full weight of her power, not just over me, but over how others saw me. Yet that realization also ignited something new. For so long I had suffered silently, but now she had exposed herself in front of witnesses. This was not just between mother and daughter anymore. This was a war fought under the eyes of the community, and I intended to fight back. The reception hall glittered with string lights and soft music, but beneath the sparkle, I carried the weight of humiliation. Every time I lifted my dress to walk, I felt the pins scratching my skin, reminding me of the tear Margaret had carved into my wedding day. Guests approached with polite smiles, yet their eyes lingered on the uneven seam. Some asked quietly if I was all right. Others whispered behind champagne glasses. I felt exposed, as though everyone could see the years of control stitched into my gown. Michael held my hand, firmly whispering that none of it mattered that we were married and nothing could change that. His steady gaze helped, but the shame burned deep. Margaret floated through the room like a queen greeting her subjects. She told relatives that a wardrobe malfunction had occurred, but Emily handled it with grace. The way she twisted the truth made my stomach churn. She had wounded me and then claimed credit for my composure. Olivia laughed at her table, pointing subtly toward me as if the whole ordeal was a comedy. I clenched my jaw and focused on the people who mattered. Sarah never left my side. She whispered over and over that I was stronger than Margaret. Her loyalty was a lifeline in that sea of judgment. When the time came for speeches, Michael's father stood and spoke warmly of love, resilience, and the joy of new beginnings. His words lifted me for a moment. Then Margaret rose. She praised Olivia for her medical career before turning toward me with a smile too sweet to be genuine. "Emily has always been sensitive," she said. "Today she showed courage despite setbacks. I am proud she finally found someone willing to care for her." Gasps and awkward chuckles rippled through the room. I felt heat rise in my chest. That was her way of undermining me again, framing Michael as my savior rather than my partner. Michael squeezed my hand so tightly I thought his anger might spill over. Instead, he stood after her speech and addressed the guests with calm dignity. "I did not marry Emily to save her," he said. "I married her because she is the strongest woman I know. She inspires me every day." The room erupted in applause. Margaret's smile froze. For the first time, I saw her mask slip just slightly. The night continued with dancing and laughter, and though the shadow of humiliation lingered, I found myself smiling genuinely in Michael's arms. As the band played our song, I realized Margaret's cruelty had not destroyed me. It had revealed me. People saw the damage, but they also saw how I carried it with grace. Strength was born from that pain. Later, when the guests departed and the hall quieted, Sarah hugged me tightly. She whispered that everyone had witnessed Margaret's true nature, no matter how she tried to spin it. They saw the scissors, the tear, the cruelty. Do not doubt that. I let those words settle in my heart. The humiliation was real, but so was the hidden strength that had carried me through. That night, in the silence of our hotel room, I sat with Michael and we talked about the future. I admitted that I feared Margaret's control would never end. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Then we will build boundaries so strong that she cannot break them." For the first time, I believed it was possible. The fallout from that day did not crush me. It planted the seed of resistance that would grow into open defiance. Margaret thought she had shamed me, but instead she had shown me that my worth did not depend on her approval. That realization would become the weapon I needed for the battles ahead. In the weeks after the wedding, the memory of my mother's scissors slicing through silk haunted me like a recurring nightmare. I woke in the middle of the night, replaying the sound over and over until Michael held me close and reminded me that we were free now. yet freedom was not immediate. Margaret called daily, demanding visits, questioning why we had not stopped by, reminding me of the sacrifices she claimed to have made. When I ignored her calls, she left long voicemails dripping with guilt. "Do not abandon your family, Emily. Remember who raised you." Each word was a chain trying to drag me back, but something inside had shifted. Instead of crumbling, I began to push back. I told her I was busy, that my marriage came first, that she could not dictate my choices anymore. Each time I said no, a spark of strength lit inside me. She responded with rage, showing up at our apartment uninvited. Michael calmly asked her to leave, his voice steady. That was when I realized I did not have to fight alone anymore. His presence was my shield. One evening, Sarah invited me over for tea. Her small kitchen smelled of chamomile and warmth. She looked at me with steady eyes and said, "Emily, I saw what your mother did. I saw the scissors. I saw the way she smirked afterward. You are not imagining it." Relief flooded me. For so long, Margaret had convinced me that my pain was exaggeration or oversensitivity. To hear someone else confirm it felt like chains breaking. Sarah went further. She told me she had heard whispers from older church members about Margaret's reputation for cruelty even before I was born. People pitied Richard for staying, but few spoke aloud. She also revealed something that stunned me. Olivia had once confided in her during college that Margaret pressured her to break off an engagement with a man she loved because he was not prestigious enough. Olivia obeyed, chasing medical accolades instead. Sarah believed Margaret's need for control had destroyed both of us in different ways. The revelation left me shaken. For the first time, I saw Olivia not just as the golden child, but as another victim, though one who aligned herself with our mother to survive. Later that night, Michael shared something he had discovered. While helping my father with some paperwork, he had stumbled across bank statements. They revealed that Margaret had drained part of the trust my grandparents left for me. It was supposed to support my education, but she had used it for home renovations and luxury trips with Olivia. My hands trembled as I held the papers. Rage surged through me. Years of struggling, of giving up my dream school, of feeling unworthy, all while she had stolen what was mine. That night, I felt a fire ignite. This was no longer just about emotional scars. It was about betrayal written in numbers and ink. The secrets were no longer hidden. I realized that if I stayed silent, I would continue to be erased. Michael suggested we confront Richard gently, hoping he would side with us. When we visited, he looked weary, his eyes shadowed by years of silence. At first, he denied knowing, but when I placed the papers in his hands, he slumped into his chair. "Margaret handles the finances," he muttered. "I thought she was saving it for you." His voice cracked with guilt, but not enough to rouse him to action. I felt a mix of pity and fury. He had watched her destroy me piece by piece, and now, even faced with proof, he would not fight. That was when I made a decision. I would gather every truth, every witness, every scar she had tried to hide. I would no longer be the obedient daughter shrinking in her shadow. I would expose her to the very society she pretended to charm. Sarah squeezed my hand when I told her my plan. She promised to stand by me. Michael nodded firmly, saying he would testify to what he saw and support me no matter the fallout. For the first time in my life, I felt a network of strength around me. The turning point had come. Margaret thought she could cut me down, but instead she had sharpened me. The secrets she buried would become the stones I used to build my freedom. I was no longer just surviving her cruelty. I was preparing to end it. The decision to fight back did not come easily. For days, I wrestled with fear. Margaret had always thrived on reputation. She was the woman who chaired church committees, hosted charity luncheons, and lectured others on morality. To speak against her meant daring to challenge a mask polished for decades. But the memory of her scissors tearing through my dress and the sight of my stolen inheritance in black and white burned too hot to ignore. One evening over dinner, Michael said softly, "Emily, you cannot heal if you keep this in the dark." His words echoed in my mind until they became undeniable. I began gathering evidence quietly. I kept copies of the bank statements. Sarah wrote a detailed account of what she saw at the wedding. Michael collected voicemails where Margaret's voice dripped venom. Even Richard, though reluctant, admitted privately that she had always controlled the finances and often manipulated him into silence. I felt as though I were piecing together a puzzle that finally showed the monster behind the smile. The opportunity for exposure came sooner than I expected. Margaret was scheduled to speak at the church's annual charity banquet, an event attended by the community's most respected members. She loved the spotlight, using it to cement her image as a pillar of grace. As I sat staring at the invitation, I realized this would be the stage where her mask could finally crack. Michael supported me but worried about the fallout. I told him the fallout was already here. She had humiliated me in front of everyone. This time, it was her turn. The night of the banquet, I dressed carefully, not in defiance but in dignity. A simple navy gown, pearls that once belonged to my grandmother, and a resolve stronger than fear. As Michael and I entered the hall, whispers followed. People still remembered the torn dress, though few dared to speak it aloud. Margaret glided across the stage later that evening, glowing with pride. She began her speech with practiced charm, thanking donors, praising Olivia's medical achievements, and slipping in comments about her dedication as a mother. I clenched my fists under the table. When she concluded with a flourish and applause rippled through the room, I stood. My heart pounded, but my voice rang clear. "I have something to say." The room hushed. Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. I stepped forward, my legs trembling yet steady enough to carry me. I told them about the wedding day, how she whispered that I would embarrass the family, how she took scissors to my dress minutes before I walked down the aisle. Gasps broke through the silence. I saw heads turn, whispers spreading like wildfire. Margaret tried to laugh to wave it off as nerves, but I continued. I held up the copies of the bank statements. I explained how she had stolen the trust fund meant for my education. I spoke of years of control, of silencing, of manipulation. My voice shook with fury and pain, but grew stronger with each word. Michael stood beside me, Sarah too, their presence like pillars. Margaret stepped forward, her face pale, yet defiant. "Lies," she spat. "She is fragile. She is making this up." But Richard rose slowly from his chair. His voice, usually quiet, carried across the hall. "It is true. Her control has poisoned this family for years." I saw the shock ripple through the crowd. A lifetime of silence shattered in that single sentence. Margaret's composure cracked. She shouted at him, at me, at anyone who dared meet her eyes. The church leaders exchanged uneasy glances. Guests whispered openly now. The image she had cultivated for decades was unraveling thread by thread. I did not stop. I told them how she pitted Olivia against me, how she destroyed relationships, how she used charity as a mask while breaking her own children in private. Every word was a blade cutting through her facade. Finally, I ended with a truth that had long burned in my chest. "You tried to define me as weak, but your cruelty has made me strong. I will not be silent anymore." The hall erupted not in applause, but in murmurs of shock, of realization, of judgment, not aimed at me, but at her. Margaret stood trembling, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting desperately for allies. Even Olivia looked away, her face pale. For the first time, Margaret was alone. The banquet ended in chaos. Some guests hurried out. Others surrounded me quietly, offering sympathy. The pastor approached me with solemn eyes, saying he would ensure the matter was addressed. Margaret fled before the evening was over, her lavender gown swirling like a retreating storm. As Michael and I left, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. I had done what I never thought possible. I had exposed her publicly. There would be backlash, I knew. Margaret was not the kind to surrender easily. But the truth was out, no longer buried beneath her lies. That night, as I lay awake beside Michael, I felt lighter than I had in years. Revenge had not been about cruelty. It had been about reclaiming my voice. I had turned her weapon of humiliation back onto her. The world now saw her for what she truly was. In the days following the banquet, the ripple of truth spread quickly through the community. People who once admired Margaret now looked at her with suspicion. The whispers at church changed tone. No longer about my torn dress, but about her deceit. Women she had once commanded in charity circles now avoided her gaze. Men who once praised her organization skills now muttered about financial impropriety. The social throne she had sat upon for decades began to crumble beneath her. At home, the collapse was more brutal. Richard moved into the guest room, refusing to share meals with her. His quiet defiance was perhaps too late, but it was real. Olivia stopped defending her so loudly her medical colleagues questioning why she never mentioned the family drama. The image Margaret had so carefully constructed was unraveling thread by thread, yet she clung desperately to denial. She called me dozens of times, leaving voicemails that swung between pleading and rage. "Emily, you are ruining this family. Emily, you must retract your lies. Emily, I am your mother. How could you do this?" Each message revealed the depth of her desperation. I saved them all, not as evidence for court, but as a reminder that I was no longer the fragile girl she could bend. Michael listened with me, sometimes shaking his head, reminding me that her power was gone. The church leaders convened a meeting and announced Margaret would step down from all committees while they investigated the misuse of funds. She tried to protest, her voice trembling with outrage, but their decision was final. That night, Sarah called to tell me people were quietly thanking her for standing with me, that many had long suspected something but never dared to speak. The cracks in Margaret's kingdom widened. Isolation grew around her like a fortress. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends stopped visiting. Even her sisters in another state called less frequently, ashamed of the scandal attached to her name. Olivia visited once, and I happened to see them through the window of a cafe, their faces strained, Olivia gesturing angrily. Later I learned she had confronted Margaret about the stolen trust fund, worried it would taint her own career. Margaret had always relied on loyalty born of fear, but now even her golden child was slipping away. At home, Margaret's temper exploded. Neighbors reported shouting matches. Richard confided to Michael that she had thrown dishes, screamed late into the night, begged him to defend her. But Richard no longer had the strength to cover her lies. He told her calmly that he would not shield her anymore. That truth spread quickly through family, shattering whatever facade remained. My own sense of liberation grew each day. Walking through town, I no longer bowed my head in shame. People stopped me to whisper that they admired my courage. Some shared their own stories of controlling mothers or cruel fathers. I realized my fight was larger than just my own survival. It was a mirror for others who had suffered in silence. Meanwhile, Margaret grew thinner, her once perfect hair now gray at the roots, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. She stopped attending services. The woman who once controlled every room now avoided public spaces entirely. When I saw her by chance outside the grocery store, she looked at me with a mixture of hatred and longing. For a brief moment, I saw not the villain, but the broken woman beneath. Yet I felt no guilt. Consequences were hers to carry. She had earned every ounce of isolation through years of cruelty. I had given her the chance to change, and she had chosen control. Now control was stripped away, leaving nothing but collapse. Weeks turned to months. Margaret's name faded from announcements, her absence from events barely mentioned. She had become a ghost in the community she once ruled. At family gatherings, she was not invited. When Christmas came, Richard joined us at our home, quietly grateful for warmth and peace. He admitted he felt freer than he had in decades, though regret hung heavy in his voice. I told him the truth. It was never too late to choose honesty. Margaret's collapse was not a spectacle anymore. It was a slow decay, witnessed by fewer and fewer people as she retreated into solitude. But I knew every silence, every empty pew, every unanswered phone call was another stone laid in the grave of her reputation. For once, justice did not need a gavel or police report. Justice was carried out in whispers and cold shoulders, in the crumbling of power she had worshipped more than love. Watching her fall did not bring me glee, but it brought me peace. The villain of my life had finally been forced to live with the echo of her own cruelty. And I, once silenced, now stood free. When the dust of exposure settled, I finally felt the first breaths of freedom. For years I had lived under Margaret's shadow, measuring myself against her impossible expectations. Now I walked into each day lighter, no longer chained to her scorn. Michael and I moved into a small house with a garden, a place filled with sunlight instead of judgment. Every morning we tended the flowers together, and as buds bloomed, I felt pieces of myself blooming too. Therapy became a steady rhythm in my weeks, not as a sign of weakness, but as a declaration that I deserved to heal. My therapist helped me untangle years of gaslighting, teaching me to separate Margaret's voice from my own. Slowly, I began to believe that my sensitivity was not a flaw, but a strength, the very quality that made me compassionate, creative, and resilient. Sarah remained a constant friend, her laughter and loyalty anchoring me. One evening over coffee, she told me, "Emily, you have become proof that silence can be broken, that control can be defeated." Her words planted courage deeper within me. Even Richard, timid for so long, began visiting us quietly. He admitted the weight of regret he carried, but also thanked me for giving him the push to stop enabling Margaret. Though I could not erase the years of his silence, I accepted his presence as part of my own healing. Olivia stayed distant, torn between ambition and shame, but I no longer chased her approval. I realized healing did not mean everyone joined me on the journey. It meant I chose peace, regardless of who walked beside me. As months passed, I began writing my experiences in journals. What started as therapy soon transformed into essays I shared with a support group. To my surprise, others resonated deeply. Women and men older than me confided that my story mirrored their own battles with controlling parents or toxic partners. Their gratitude filled me with purpose. I was no longer just surviving my story, I was giving it meaning. One spring morning, Michael and I discovered we were expecting a child. The news carried both joy and fear. For a moment, Margaret's voice echoed in my memory, warning, belittling, cutting. But then, I looked at Michael's eyes, shining with hope, and I felt determination harden in my chest. This child would grow not in chains, but in freedom. I promised myself that the cycle of control would end with me. When I shared the news with Sarah, she hugged me tightly and whispered that this was my true new beginning. The pregnancy became a season of empowerment. Each kick reminded me that life was growing inside me, life untouched by Margaret's cruelty. I decorated the nursery with soft colors-filled shelves with books and imagined reading stories not of shame, but of courage. Michael painted the walls while humming his steady presence, a symbol of the love that had carried me through the darkest times. As my belly grew, so did my resolve. The day Margaret attempted to call again, leaving another voicemail of blame, I simply deleted it. No rage, no tears, no trembling, just silence. That silence was my victory. By the time our daughter was born, I felt transformed. Holding her tiny body against my chest, I whispered promises that she would never know the pain of scissors cutting through her joy. She would grow in a home where her voice mattered, where love was not conditional, where strength was celebrated rather than crushed. In that moment, I knew the true meaning of empowerment. Healing was not forgetting the scars. It was using them as a map to build something better. Margaret's downfall had been public, but my triumph was personal. I had reclaimed my voice, my life, and now I was shaping a future built on freedom. When friends visited to meet the baby, they told me they admired my courage, that they hoped their own children would learn to stand as I had. Their words humbled me, but also reminded me that every act of resistance ripples outward. My story was no longer just mine. It was a beacon for anyone trapped in silence. Standing in the nursery one quiet evening, I looked at my sleeping daughter and felt tears of gratitude. The girl who once trembled at her mother's whisper had grown into a woman who silenced those whispers forever. The cycle was broken. The new beginning had arrived, and this time it was mine to write. Looking back now, I see my life as a story divided into two chapters. The first was written by Margaret, every page soaked with her control, her cutting words, her hunger for power. The second I wrote myself with courage, inked in pain, but also in defiance. When I remember my wedding day, I no longer see only the torn silk or the humiliation. I see the moment the mask slipped, the moment the truth began to breathe. That cut in my dress became the cut in her armor. It was painful, it was public, but it opened the door to freedom. For years, I believed my worth was measured by my mother's approval, that my silence was survival. Now I know silence is a prison. Speaking out, though terrifying, is the only key to escape. My story taught me that family can wound deeper than strangers, but it also taught me that blood is not destiny. We can choose which legacies we carry forward and which we leave behind. Margaret's legacy ends with me. My daughter will grow in light, not under the shadow of manipulation. She will know a mother's love that uplifts rather than destroys. That is the final justice, the truest revenge. Margaret lost her kingdom of control, and I found my kingdom of peace. To the women and men who whisper to me their own stories, I say this: you are not weak for suffering, you are strong for surviving. And you will be stronger still when you speak. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for an audience. The act of reclaiming your voice is victory itself. When I stood in that banquet hall, I was trembling, certain my words would collapse around me. Instead, they became wings that carried me out of bondage. Every person deserves that flight. Margaret lives now in isolation, the echoes of her choices surrounding her. I do not rejoice in her misery, but I accept it as the cost of cruelty. She taught me through pain what I never want to become. For that, I feel strangely grateful. Life has a way of carving lessons into scars, but scars are proof of healing too. As I hold my daughter as I walk hand in hand with Michael as I laugh with Sarah, I understand that the best revenge is not the public collapse of a tyrant. The best revenge is joy, freedom, and the quiet certainty that you have broken the cycle. My story began with scissors cutting my dress. It ends with me cutting the strings that bound me. And in that act, I finally became whole.